All right, so we're back. So this idea of the papal bull, right? So this is what like the first domino to fall that creates the shift from African people being viewed as divine entities to them being set on the platter for enslavement. So to get into the text, and again, we're going to be dealing with chapters 1 and 2, which you guys did not read, but it has some very important fundamental and foundational information that I wanted to provide to you. So one of the reasons why this text becomes vastly important, right? Especially in like the late 80s, early 90s, there was a vast debate around what was the impetus for enslavement. Was it a racist institution, right? Or was money, capital, the driving force behind enslavement? So Eric Williams puts out this book to kind of address that quandary, right? And he says slavery was an economic institution of the first importance. It had been the basis of Greek economy and had built up the Roman Empire. In modern times, it provided the sugar for the tea and the coffee cups in the Western world, excuse me, as a typo. It produced the cotton to serve as a basis for modern imperialism. It made the American South and the Caribbean islands seen in historical perspective. It forms a part of the general picture of the harsh treatment of the underprivileged class. The unsympathetic poor laws and served feudal laws, and the indifference with which the rising capitalist class was beginning to reckon prosperity in terms of pounds, sterlings, and becoming used to the idea of sacrificing human life to the deity of increased production. So let's kind of deal with the second half of the passage, right? We see in the first half is very straightforward. Slavery was an economic institution, right? And he makes the claim that even the Greco-Roman society, Greco-Roman Empire, their wealth was based off of enslavement, right? But then he moves further and he says that this system of enslavement, right, it forms the part of the general picture of the harsh treatment of the underprivileged class, right? So this is the impetus, this is the start of society being comfortable with treating the underclass worse, right? That gives them the authority, that gives them the justification to treat people of a lower class worse. And this is one of the things that the institution of enslavement produced, right? It's the culture that the institution of enslavement produced, right? Becoming used to the idea of sacrificing human life to the deity, and this is very important, the deity, I want you guys to think about that, of increased production. Now, if we think about these past weeks, what we've been going over, we talked about Ma'at, right? And we talked about how Ma'at is a goddess or a deity, right? We talked about Imhotep and how because of what he was able to do in his time on earth, he was elevated to God status. And he became a deity within Kemetic tradition, okay? So this is how the Kemetic society positions these deities. Couple of minutes ago, I went through Oshun, Yemenya, Shango, Ogun, right? Those are West African deities. And they all serve spiritual principles, right? But what Williams is claiming, the West got used to making their deity increase production. So the God that is being served in the West is increased production. Y'all with me on that? All right. So slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racial twist has thereby been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. Unfree labor in the New World was brown, white, black, and yellow, Catholic, Protestant, pagan, right? So it doesn't matter what you look like, the driving force was the unpaid labor, okay? But then there's a shift that takes place. And the Spaniards discovered that one Negro was worth 4 Indians. A prominent official in Hispaniola insisted that in 1518, that permission be given to bring Negroes as a race for robust labor instead of natives, so weak that can only be employed in tasks requiring little endurance, such as taking care of maize fields or farm. So they're saying that, again, if the driving force is increased production, right? Free labor. Then they make the realization that one African puts as much work output as 4 Indians, right? The Africans become economically more viable because of their labor production, right? And they said that the natives were so weak they can only be employed in tasks requiring little endurance. Now, to me, when I read that, I think about this maybe as the natives using their weakness as a subversive tactic, right? So they can get out of the work. So I didn't attest this to the native people being weak. I thought them as being fugitive and using this as a means to get them out of slave labor. So the immediate successor of the Indian, however, was not the Negro, but the poor white. These white servants included a variety of types. Some were indentured servants, so-called because before departure from the homeland, they had signed a contract indented by law, bringing them to service for a stipulated time in return for their passage. Others were convicts sent out by the deliberate policy of the home government to serve for a specified period. So again, with both of these, with all of these circumstances involving the white working class, white labor force, their labor was for a specified period in time, right? So once they served their contract time, they were free to go. Also, what happens is once these Europeans get to this new land and they discover by law, right, if you're white, you're entitled land and at least 3 enslaved Africans, they didn't see the need to serve out their contract, right? They just situated themselves as free, got the land that was entitled to them by their whiteness, and they got the slaves that came along with it, or the enslaved Africans that came along with it, right? So this is another problem that was presented by trying to incorporate the poor whites as slave labor force. Here, then, is the origins of Negro slavery. Again, the reason was economic, not racial. It had to do not with the color of the laborer, but the cheapness of the laborer. As compared with the Indian and white labor, Negro slavery was eminently superior. In each case, writes Bassett, so this is another student of the enslavement period, right? Someone who studies this time period, Bassett, discussing North Carolina, it was the survival of the fittest. Both Indian slavery and white servitude. And then notice the difference, right? Indian slavery and white servitude. So again, there's a white, it was servitude because it was for a certain moment in time, right? The Indians weren't able to do away with their slave status. The Africans weren't able to do away with their slave status. So that's the difference in the distinction between slavery and servitude, right? Were to go down before the Black man's superior endurance, docility, and I put like a hyphen around the docility because I don't necessarily agree with that. Somebody articulate for us what docility means, just to make sure we all have an understanding. What does it mean to be docile? Y'all sleep? What does it mean to be docile?
To be submissive.
To be submissive, thank you. Okay, so the reason why I put those brackets there is I don't agree with this claim. And as we get further into the lecture, you'll see some reasons as to why not, right? So this is why they're saying that the African was more conducive for the experience of enslavement, right? Their endurance, quote unquote, docility, and their labor capacity. The features of the man, his hair, color, and deference, his subhuman characteristics were so widely pleaded were only the later rationalizations to justify a simple fact that the colonies needed labor and resorted to Negro labor because it was the cheapest and best. So really that's why African people were placed in this institution of enslavement, right? They just had the physical capacity to do the work, period, according to Williams. So we'll shift to chapter 2. So this kind of, to me, speaks to the culture of the institution of enslavement, right? Not the actual practice of it or how it manifested, but from the standpoint of work, right? But how the culture of it kind of manifested. So little black boys were the appendages of slave captions. So what is an appendage? Somebody articulate that for us. What is an appendage? Or give an example of an appendage. We all have them. What is an appendage?
Like our fingers?
Yep, a finger could be an appendage, your arms are appendage, your legs are appendages. They're extensions of the body that can be put to use, right? So little black boys were the appendages of slave capture. Fashionable ladies or women of easy virtue. So Hogarth is a author. You could say her protagonist, his protagonist, his heroine, and the Harlot's Progress. This is a book that he wrote. Is attended by a Negro boy and Margaret Steen's Arabella Burstrom's, I don't know what that is. This is another book, typifies 18th century English opinion and her desire for a little black boy who she could love as her long-haired kitten. So the way in which this is being articulated, right? The women in particular, with this passage is talking about, they viewed little African children as pets, if you will, right? Something the equivalent of a purse or a handbag, right? They refer to them as kittens, right? So not individuals, not human beings, not people who have mothers and fathers, right? But appendages, things that are used, that are at my disposal, right? The slave traders were among the leading humanitarians of the age. John Carey, advocate of the slave trade, was conspicuous for his integrity and humanity and was the founder of a society known as the Incorporation of the Poor. What is a humanitarian? What type of work do humanitarians do? Who is a humanitarian in our society today? To provide an example.
Would it be the government since they promote?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
So think about like philanthropists. Think about
Like activists?
Activists could be considered a philanthropist. Typically, they're people who are wealthy, like real well-to-do. For example, Bill Gates would be considered a philanthropist, and they engage in these like humanitarian efforts to improve society, right? So they'll be concerned with homelessness. They'll be concerned with food insecurities, right? They'll be concerned with little villages in Africa not being able to get water. So they'll go set up things to allow them to get water, right? So this is what the humanitarians do. So what Williams is articulating to us is that slave traders were the leading humanitarians of their age, right? So they were the most concerned with humanity in this age. Think about that contradiction, right? Think about what that says for this particular society, to where your people who are engaging in human trafficking are considered the most socially aware, social conscious, and most concerned with the plight of humanity, okay? And then this individual, John Carey, right? He's a founder of a society known as the Incorporation for the Poor. So his concern is addressing the needs of poor people, while at the same time, he's using a class of people, a nation of people, to give him free labor, right? So where, again, the contradictions in this society. I know the chat is going off. I can't see the chat. So if you want to say your piece, that's more than okay. Second bullet point. So before the American Revolution, English public opinion in general accepted the view of the slave trader, right? They had no problems with slave trading. So to traffic in human creatures may at first sight appear barbarous, inhuman, and unnatural, Yet the traders herein have as much to plead in their own excuse as can be said for some of the other branches of trade, namely the advantages of it. In a word, from this trade proceeds benefits far outweigh all other real, either real or pretend mischief and inconveniences. So essentially what they're saying is, right, the benefits of the institution of enslavement outweigh any pretend or real mischief or inconvenience, right? And we're not going to call them atrocities. We're not going to call them tortures. We're not going to call it terrorism. At best, they're pretend or maybe real mischief or an inconvenience, right? And think about how Glissant articulated the experience of being placed in the open boat. That's far from an inconvenience, right? So speaking of Glissant and the open boat, the image on your upper right-hand side with the individuals in a circle and it looks like they're underwater, I believe I mentioned when we were reading Glissant and we were talking about the underwater signposts that there's a memorial to the Africans who were thrown overboard or who jumped overboard to avoid the institution of enslavement. That's the image of that memorial. Below that image is the door of no return. And this is on a slave dungeon in Ghana. And essentially the story has it, once you go beyond that gate, you're never coming back, right? So another way to think about it are these are images of two of the abyss that Glissant articulates, right? That second abyss being the water, and then the third abyss being what was left behind, right? So these two images can reflect that. The image to your left is pretty obvious. A man's back that was brutalized through the torture of enslavement. Now there's this concept called Maafa, and Maafa is a Swahili term that just means the great disaster, right? And by and large, Africans people look at the enslavement experience as a Maafa, as a great disaster, right? It was, of course, the native Africans in particular whom whites feared the most because the whites understood that they knew something else besides slavery. These Africans naturally maintained a much stronger historical memory and cultural identity than those Africans who were born into slavery, right? So again, think about what I was saying as far as the brackets that says the Africans were docile, and I didn't agree with that, right? This speaks to that here. They know that the Africans who still had their connection to Africa were the most difficult to deal with, right? Because they knew that this institution, this enslavement that they were experiencing was not who they were, it was the experience that they were going through. So they fought endlessly and ceasingly to free themselves, right? Second bullet point, African attacks were often mislabeled as Indian attacks because so many maroon African individuals and groups had formed very tight alliances with the so-called Native American groups. So one, a lot of rebellions that Africans engaged in were misclassified as Indian attacks. And then we have this word, the maroon, many maroon Africans. So this is a framework. Maroonage can be viewed as a framework, right? It's the process of freeing yourself from enslavement and establishing communities of freed enslaved Africans that sustained and maintained their freedom. Oftentimes, the Maroons would blend into Native American or in indigenous communities. The Seminole Indians were famous for being a Maroon community, right? These are enslaved Africans who freed themselves, who blended with Native American and established a community, an ethnic tribe known as the Seminoles, right? So this notion of Maroonage is a framework. There's a society of Maroons in Jamaica who freed themselves from the Jamaican plantations and set up communities that are still thriving to this day, right? So this is this concept or this notion of maroonage. A slave had no sense of himself that was separate from the self that the master wanted him to have. Thus, it was that no Black had a name of his own. He was given the surname of his owner, no matter how many owners he had during his life. So I think I may have mentioned this. The three vestiges of enslavement. When I say a vestige, it's just a lasting effect, right? It's our names, our language, and our religion, right? So in the African context, before enslavement, African people had African names. Before enslavement, African people spoke African languages. Before enslavement, African people had African religions, right? In the indigenous context, before colonization, indigenous people spoke indigenous languages. Before colonization, indigenous people had indigenous religions. Before colonization, indigenous people had indigenous names, right? So these are the three vestiges of not only enslavement, but colonialism as well, right? The second bullet point speaks to another one of those vestiges. Religion also presented the slaves with the idea that they would receive their reward in heaven after they died. This appealed to their minds, the idea of a suffering-free heaven after death because of the wretchedness of their present life condition of the immeasurable suffering. Now, this is also important because it causes them to be docile, right? Part of that religion doctrination was, yes, you'll get your afterlife in heaven, but you have to be a good slave here on earth. You have to obey your master here on earth in order to transition into the afterlife. Juxtapose that to the way that Ma'at works, right? And what will get you successfully into the afterlife in the Ma'atan context, and what will get you to the afterlife in the Christian context. So along with maroonage is this notion of fugitivity. And you cannot be a maroon unless you are a fugitive first, right? And this passage speaks to this idea of fugitivity. Fugitive slaves or fugitive enslaved Africans, Africans who escaped from the plantation and were at large, become powerful sources, if not of the most powerful source, of persistent and protracted resistance to enslavement among the Africans. When Africans rebelled and escaped, they typically took weapons such as guns, knives, as well as tools and provisions. Thus, plans to sustain themselves and defend their freedom were a regular part of insurrection activity. It is also true that the killing of whites was also a frequent aspect of African slave revolts, as opposed to being only an occasional or incidental occurrence, right? So these African people were active in pursuing their freedom, right? When you think about the framework of fugitivity, think about Harriet Tubman, right? She's the embodiment of fugitivity, returning back and forth to the plantation over 21 times to free other enslaved Africans, right? That is the embodiment, the quintessential essence of this notion of fugitivity. Okay. So that is my lecture. Again, I apologize for the lecture. I really try not to do this. But I wanted to make sure that you guys got that information. So with the time that we have left, about 12 minutes, let's engage in conversation. We could either talk about what you guys discussed in your breakout rooms, or we could talk about what was discussed in the mini lecture, whatever you guys so choose. But please talk back, right?
I thought the reading was interesting because it was basically saying, well, I think it was basically saying that the capitalists, like the British, were using enslavement against the West Indies to benefit themselves, not necessarily to benefit anybody who was enslaved, because they also benefited from Brazilian and Cuban and American slavery during that time. So it's like a, haha, I don't want you to become a larger monopoly than us. And that's why we're against slavery, just for you guys, though.
Yeah.
And then it also reminded me of just how late the Emancipation Proclamation was, because that was in 1863. And they were talking about bills in this that were being passed or being legislated on in like 1815 or in the earlier 1800s.
That's a very good point. And I think too, the why behind Britain taking a disavow towards enslavement, right? while the rest of the world was still going agricultural. Because of the wealth that Britain amassed, they were able to transition into a industrial revolution, right? So the need for agriculture wasn't really there. Um, and also, I think what Jeremy's speaking to speaks to the way Britain views themselves now, right? They don't view themselves as a largely racist society, right? They view racism as an American phenomenon, right? But recently, because of the influx of African migrants into Europe, and then also in the early 80s, because of the same thing, and really more so in the early 80s, there's a lot of Caribbean migrants going to Europe. With the birth of Thatcherism, with Margaret Thatcher becoming the prime minister in the UK at that time, you see this anti-Black sentiment, you see this anti-migrant sentiment that kind of rises in Europe. But they still try to position themselves as not being a racist society because they didn't have racism on their land like America did, right? But they were the driving force behind enslavement throughout the world, right? So that's a very good point. Anyone else? So Kenneth, what was your,
What
right?
what I got from the reading was what I think it, it was very dense, but from what I got from it, I think the main message was how it reflects the shallowness of of capitalism and how it tends to taint morals. And what I found this best reflected in, I I think it's on page 172, a passage where he says, after 1833, the capitalists were still involved in the slave trade itself. British goods from Manchester and Liverpool, cottons, feathers, and shackles were sent direct to the coast of Africa or indirectly to Rio de Janeiro or and Havana. And I found this interesting because earlier in the passage, I also read how they were actually against the British. They were largely against the slavery that was happening in Brazil, I think. And I just think that it's largely hypocritical. And earlier in the passage, I said that some of the biggest humanitarians at the time were those who were enslaving the people. And I just think it's really hypocritical.
Yeah. And I mean, and really, you're absolutely right, but I don't think we're too far off from that moment, right? Like let's call it what it is. Um, a lot of your philanthropic individuals and agencies and organizations, right? They get their money from um, oppressed labor forces. So, for example, everyone who has a computer, a cell phone, any type of electronic device, that those devices would not work without coltan, right? This is a mineral that's found in the Congo. There's vast atrocities taking place in the Congo for the ability to gather, for the ability to gather this mineral out of the Congo, right? So when you talk about Bill Gates doing his philanthropic work, when you talk about companies like Apple doing philanthropic work in Africa, right? That's an oxymoron. That's a contradiction because your ability to be wealthy, your ability to be the super structures that you are due to the fact that you're using cheap labor force and especially when it comes to the cobalt mining, right? Those mining conditions are just as bad as the rubber mining conditions, as the gold mining conditions. They're no different, right? So this contradiction still takes place, right? And I don't remember who said it, but it's something likened to the fact of any wealth accumulated in this society, a crime is behind it, right? Someone has been taken advantage of because this is the way that capitalism orients itself, right? You have to have an oppressed, exploited class for capitalism to work, right? Go ahead, can you speak on it, man? Unless your mic doesn't work.
Okay, so I'm gonna just say what I typed in chat. So what I got from the reading was how England would disregard slavery life for the benefit of the society of England, and even though they like abolished it, they still benefited off of Cuba and American slavery, just like Jeremy said.
Yeah. And I think, right, you're doing no good by abolishing slavery if you're still benefiting from it, right? Like that's not doing anything to move society forward, right? You're just trying to distance yourself and keep your nose clean. So that's really not anything of a charitable act or a moral or a ethical act, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I feel like this kind of reminds me of how like some big name companies nowadays will take advantage of specific movements to get their money's worth. And it kind of pisses me off. Because I'm like, your opinion doesn't mean shit if you actually don't care about it. So
Yeah. Nike, absolutely. The NFL, another big company that does a lot of that. But I taught a TV, film, and video class last semester, and what they called that was woke capitalism, right? I'm gonna appear to be woke, but I'm gonna still push my capitalist agenda, and I think it's a perfect term for what takes place there and what course coincides there. Let's do this. Let's get one more comment about the reading or the lecture, and then we'll call it a day, and I'll let you guys know what you'll be reading for next week.
I find it interesting on page 172 at the very end, it says, leave slave trade alone and it would commit suicide. I feel like that's like completely the opposite of what it would happen. Like leaving something alone would just allow it to like further grow.
Yeah, let me see, because I think capitalists have had enough of political experiment. Commerce was very emancipated. The only way to put down slavery was to trust the general. Okay, so I think what that's speaking to is the fact that if Britain was, in some regards, the moving force behind enslavement, right? Like they were the oil behind the machine, if you will, right? And if we were to leave it alone, there's no oil to run the machine, so it would create suicide. If the miscreants of any nation chose to engage in it, this is after what you read, their guilt be upon their own heads. Leave to a higher tribunal the moral government of the world, right? The money expanded in fruitless efforts to suppress the slave trade could be more beneficial and philosophically employed at home, right? So they're just saying that if we withdraw, the people who engage in it won't have the apparatus to make it be successful. And at that point, it's on them to deal with the moral repercussions of still engaging in enslavement, right? But I agree with you in the sense that just because you're not engaging anymore, it doesn't necessarily say that it's going to die out. Because even in the passage, she says, right, or he says, excuse me, the miscreants of any nation who choose to engage in it, their guilt beyond their heads. So it's still showing that people would still try to engage in this enslavement institution. But very good point. So for next week, give me 1 second. Let me pull up our Google Classroom site. I'll show you the readings for next week. Classwork. Okay, so for next week, we'll be reading M. Gomez, Reversing Sale. And don't worry about page 170. The reading actually starts on page 171, games people play, all the way through Another Way. I'm sorry. So once Another Way starts, you don't need to read that. Like stop before you get Another Way. So this, all of this simply because they were Black. That's where you would end at. So that'll be your reading for next week. Your journal will discuss, and then we'll get back to our fishbowl in our normal flow next week. Reminder again, there's an extra credit opportunity today at 5:30. Also, while you guys were in breakout rooms, I got a email from a professor who serves not only in the Pan-African Studies department, but she also serves in the TV, film, and video department. There is a film festival that is taking place this week, or this next coming week. I will provide you guys the details on the Google Classroom site as well as the email. She's looking for student panelists. It's free entry, and you get opportunity to see a lot of the dope presentations and film productions that are kind of taking place with your fellow students. So that will be available to you probably tomorrow at the latest, but possibly sometime today. Are there any questions